This video is brought to you by Sailrite. Visit Sailrite.com for all your project supplies, tools, and instructions. In this video tutorial, we'll show you how to make a 4-bow Bimini top. A Bimini top like this provides protection from the sun and shelter from the rain. Our frame's been mounted to a wooden platform so we can pattern it and build it indoors. This video tutorial will show you every step required to build a 4-bow Bimini, including patterning, sewing zippers, and how to build a backstay slit into your Bimini top. Before we can build this 4-bow Bimini top, we need a frame to pattern on. Check out the frame kits at Sailrite. Sailrite offers a 7/8" stainless steel frame or a 1" stainless steel frame. We're using a 1" stainless steel frame in this video. If you need to make a stainless steel frame for your 4-bow Bimini, check out the video here. This video will walk you through the steps of making a 4-bow Bimini frame from a Sailrite kit. You can pick a Bimini skin kit at the Sailrite website. Our Bimini skin kits can be modified to fit your particular needs. Want to change the color of the thread or the zippers or even the fabric brand? Give us a call. We're glad to help. The 4-bow frame for this Bimini top has already been erected. Here are some of the common terms that you will find throughout this video. Let's get started and build our 4-bow Bimini top from a Bimini skin kit from Sailrite. Utilizing the webbing that comes with the kit, we've attached side release buckles to it, and we will run the webbing over the primary bow and under the intermediate bows, then around the secondary bow and back to the primary bow. We'll be using this webbing to pre-tension the primary and secondary bow so that they are actually tensioned slightly before we do our patterning. This will make for a tighter fitting Bimini, especially at the center location. Once the buckle is secured, he will push it away from the primary bow, grab the loose strap, and then start tensioning the bows. The objective here is to tension the middle of the bow but not cause the outer edges to flex. Here's a close-up of what we're doing to the secondary bow. Let's look at that one more time in slow motion here. Notice the center is flexing in while the sides are really not being affected much. That's exactly what we want. We want no more tension than that. Be sure to move the webbing strap to the center location, or at least beside the center location mark. Before tensioning, our measurement for the span was 98 inches. Now, under some tension, let's remeasure it. And now we get about 1.5 inches less at 96.5 inches. Next, run strapping tape from the intermediate bow to the primary bow and temporarily tape it in place, leaving the leg of tape loose at the primary bow so you can make adjustments. We'll follow that same procedure for the intermediate bow at the secondary bow. Set the two intermediate bows higher than the primary and secondary bows for water runoff. 2 to 3 inches is necessary. Now we'll take a tape measure between the intermediate bow and the primary bow or the secondary bow. We need to do it for both, and we want those measurements to be almost the same. We also want that measurement to be as close as possible between the two intermediate bows. So try to balance it out until you have measurements that are almost the same between the 3 spans. Once that's achieved, you can secure the strapping tape in place. Now we need to run strapping tape between the two intermediate bows at the center position, so that's what Bill is doing here. The center line of our Bimini frame is secure, but we need to do the same thing to the starboard and port sides, and we will do this at each one of the splines or joints. So we're taking measurements between those two areas on the starboard and port for this, the primary bow, and then we will tape it at those locations with the 3M strapping tape there. We're going to leave our strapping tape long so that we can make adjustments if necessary. So we're just going to leave a tail on both of these. Then we're going to reconfirm our measurements yet again because we want the space on the starboard and port side between spans or joints to be the same. If they are not, make adjustments. If they are, strap it down securely. Ours are good. Skip the intermediate bows and move to the secondary bow and its intermediate bow, and follow that same procedure on both the starboard and port sides. We're going to skip ahead here. After this is secured, we need to move to the intermediate two bows. And there we're going to do the same procedure. However, here we don't have to measure. We just need to make sure that the bows are taut. So Bill is applying pressure towards the secondary bow on this intermediate bow for the primary. And then he will tape it securely in place.
All we're doing is stabilizing now. It's like chasing that corner.
And here he does it at the other side at the joint, being sure that it is taut. Now our Bimini frame is very secure and rigid, and it's ready for patterning. Sometimes the lines that are traced on top of the strapping tape become worn off as you are setting up the frame. So here we're using an old compass with a Sharpie marker installed to retrace the lines that were traced on top of the 3M strapping tape that we placed on the bows. At the side of each bow, we want to mark where we want the skirt to end. Typically, it is about 6 to 8 inches down from the curve. So here we are marking a line that we will measure. This will be our first line for our skirt. Now we'll measure from the floor up to determine its distance. It is 43 3/4. So we will do that again to the primary bow. That was the secondary bow. And then we're going to use a length of line or string, and we're going to attach it at that skirt line on the primary bow and run it to the secondary bow. That skirt line on the primary and secondary bow is exactly the same distance up from the floor. The center of our skirt at the intermediate bows, both of them, we're going to raise it up 1.5 inches from that line that we taped on. So we're doing that at the two intermediate bows. Bill's going to tape the line up to that point on the intermediate bow just to show you what it will look like when the Bimini top is done. So it actually rises up on the two intermediate bows and then comes down slightly on the primary and secondary bow. Take a measurement on the intermediate bow, and you need to transfer all of those skirt measurements to the opposite side bows. The next step in preparing for patterning is to apply seam stick for basting tape along the top of our strapping tape on top of the line that we struck on the bows. We need to do this all the way down the length of the bow to the skirt edge where we marked where the skirt edge will stop. This needs to be done for all 4 of the bows. Here we are applying it to the intermediate bow. When it comes time to pattern on top of the intermediate bow, we typically notice that the top of the bow really should have the double-sided tape. So here we're applying the 3M strapping tape more to the top side of the intermediate bow, and we will run another or a second row of seam stick at that location just so that we can be assured that the pattern material will stick well to the intermediate bow, since the basting tape, the first run, is slightly at an angle. So now that the 3M strapping tape is down for a second time, Bill runs another row of seam stick for canvas along top of it, mainly on top of the bow, which will make patterning much easier. So 2 rows of seam stick on the intermediate bows only. Using Durascrim pattern material, we'll start with the secondary bow and the intermediate bow, patterning on top of those 2. This Durascrim pattern material is a little bit too large. We want at least 6 inches all around the perimeter. So here we're cutting about a foot or so away from the skirt edge. Bill removes the transfer paper from the double-sided tape, revealing the glue, and then he'll baste this front edge on the secondary bow, leaving about 6 inches overhanging. Now he will roughly baste it in place, and then he'll do his final adjustments after he has it basted on the intermediate bow. But yet there's still too much pattern material, so some of it is cut away from the intermediate bow. Be careful not to cut any of your strapping tape that actually holds the frame together. If you do that, you'll have to restrap it and remeasure it. Now the 2 strips of double-sided tape on the intermediate bow are removed, the transfer paper that is, revealing the glue, and he starts to pull on the Durascrim pattern material to baste it in place. The nice thing about the double-sided tape and the Durascrim pattern material is that you can apply it and then pull it up and reapply it until you're happy with the way the pattern looks. Your goal is to remove as many wrinkles as possible and get the Durascrim pattern material to lay nice and flat. If it has wrinkles or any kind of hard spots, they will show up in the fabric, so do your best here. It's also important not to stretch the Durascrim pattern material too much. There are fabric scrim lines running through the Durascrim material diagonally to help prevent stretching the material. But if you overstretch it, you can actually warp it out of shape. So try to do this carefully. Bill continues to work around the frame on the secondary bow, and he'll also do the same on the intermediate bow until he's happy with the way the pattern material looks laying over the bows. It's nice and taut, and there are very few, if any, wrinkles in it. So now it's perfect. It's ready for patterning.
That extra layer of basting tape. Is that what you're looking at?
Yep. It is very important to label the panel so you do not get confused. This edge is the bow. Sout has been marked for starboard out. Port will be marked, and center locations will also be marked. Center locations are very important as well. This is the stern end of this pattern. When marking port, we mark pout for port out and sout for starboard out. Now we have an old compass, and we're going to use that to trace the line that's directly under the Durascrim pattern material. You can see through the Durascrim pattern material to pattern on top of it. If you don't have a compass like this, you can put dash marks on top of that line that can be joined up later to represent the edge of the bimini on that pattern material. When marking the pattern, be sure to mark all the way down to the skirt line that was struck on the bows. So here again, we're coming down the starboard side and marking directly on top of that line, and then we mark the line where the skirt edge rests. So we mark a horizontal line at that location. We'll do that on the starboard side and the port side. Center locations have already been marked, but Bill's just ensuring that that mark is clear and he can read it easily. Now he's cutting the pattern material that is not directly basted to the bow so that he can use that compass where the 3M strapping tape holds the pattern together. Here we're marking on the intermediate bow in the same manner that we marked on the secondary bow. Ensure that everything is marked, then you can remove the pattern material. We have obviously left the basting tape on that intermediate bow when we did the first pattern, so now we'll take some more Durascrim pattern material and lay it between the 2 intermediate bows for the center panel. We'll follow that same exact procedure again. First, the Durascrim pattern material is too large, then we'll baste one of the intermediate bows down, and then we'll baste the other side down, position the pattern material until we're happy, and all wrinkles and hard spots are removed. As you can see, the Durascrim pattern material is stuck down to the bow, and then it is removed from the bow and rebasted until everything looks nice and neat. Now that Bill's happy with the pattern material between the two intermediate bows, or the center panel, he will mark center positions. He will mark Sout for starboard out and Pout for port out, and he will also label the panel so that he can easily distinguish it from the other two. Two meaning the next one that we'll do. Here Bill's going to cut the Durascrim pattern material where the strapping tape lies so that it can rest down along the side of the bow so that he can easily mark the Durascrim pattern material with his hand up against the bow. So here he marks the skirt edge. Now he's going to mark it without using that compass. And as I discussed earlier, sometimes marking dashes. If you'd like to try your hand and draw a straight line on top of the line underneath the Durascrim material, be my guest. But dashes are typically more accurate, and you can just join the line segments together when you take it over to the table and finalize your patterning. Be sure to mark the skirt edges for this intermediate panel as well. The panel on the primary and intermediate bow was not shown, but here it is complete. You would just follow that same procedure for it as well. Now we have all three patterns ready, and we can move on to patterning our fabric. Before we can pattern the fabric, we need to add a 1/2 inch seam allowance to the forward and aft edge of each panel. So here we're using a flexible ruler to add that 1/2 inch. You may have something different that you can use to mark along the edge of the line that we just struck on it. But basically, this will allow for our semi-flat filled seam, which will join the panels together. Now for the skirt edges, the starboard and port side of the Bimini, we do not want to add a 1/2 inch seam allowance there. Instead, we're going to join the two marks with a straight edge. You can actually do this entire project with a fairly small table, as you can see here. The pattern is actually larger than the table, but we can drag it to one side or the other so that we can finish our patterning. And we'll be using the same two small tables to actually baste and prepare our fabric Bimini top as well. To help hold the pattern in place as we mark it, we're using sandbags. If you do not have those, you can use books or some other heavy object to hold your pattern in place as you pattern it and as you pattern it over top of the fabric. So you'll see us using that all throughout this video. Now we just simply cut along that 1/2 inch line that we struck outside of the first line, and we'll cut along the straight edge as well on the line that we struck on the sides. Here's the center panel. We strike a line there, and we also add the 1/2 inch seam allowance to its forward and aft edge as well. Now we'll use the Sunbrella marine grade fabric that's included in our kit and start patterning using the patterns that we just made. Our fabric is 60 inches wide, and typically this is probably the best way to nest the panels for patterning, as you can see here at the top of this illustration. Once the pattern's in place and very close to the edge of the fabric, we'll use those sandbags and position them on the fabric material to help hold it in place. Then we'll use our soapstone pencil and start marking around the perimeter of the pattern material, transferring its edge location onto the fabric material underneath. Once all of the material that's marked on the tabletop is marked, we can leave our weights in place, which helps hold our pattern on top of our fabric, and pull the fabric to the opposite side of the table so we can pattern that side as well. At the skirt edges, since it's a straight line, we'll just use a yardstick or a straight edge and mark a line joining the two marks at the corners. That completes this top. Now, very important to mark it. completely. So transfer all of the markings, including the center position, which is extremely important, onto the Sunbrella marine grade fabric. Again, we're using the soapstone pencil that's available from Sailrite. Highly recommended for any type of patterning like this. This is our aft panel. Now we have it traced out, we can cut it out with a Sailrite edge hot knife. Using a hot knife like this will help seal the edges of the fabric and keep them from unraveling. On the edges where the center location is marked, be sure to cut into those edges, making a small notch about a 1/4 inch into the fabric. That way we'll never lose the center location, which is very important. We are also cutting on top of a metal ruler to prevent damage to the tabletop below. Here we're marking another center location with the Sailrite edge hot knife. The aft panel is done. Now we'll work on the forward panel. So we've just simply scooted our fabric down and placed our forward pattern on top of the fabric. We did not show marking around it, but now we're labeling it and cutting it out. Now the forward panel is done. We'll move on now to the center panel. The process for it is done exactly in the same manner. We've laid it on top of our fabric as close to the edges as possible and checked to make sure that it is going to be over the entire span of fabric on both the port and starboard side. And then we start marking just like we did with the aft and forward panels. Here at the edge, which is the skirt edge, we're using a straight edge since it's a straight line. Once this panel is traced around, be sure to mark all port and starboard sides and also center locations, just like we did on the other ones, and then cut it out with the Sailrite edge hot knife. Next, we're going to create the pockets or sleeves for the forward portion of the Bimini and the aft portion of the Bimini. To accomplish this, we'll have to pattern off of the aft pattern's aft edge and the forward panel's forward edge, as seen here in yellow highlighted. Bill starts with the aft panel. He lays it on top of some scrap material that was left over and places his weights on top. Then, along that edge that we just discussed, he will trace about 8 inches or so up from the edge of the material. Then he'll trace the aft edge of this aft panel. This is how we create the sleeve or the pocket for the aft edge of the aft panel. When he's traced half of it, he'll move his weights and carefully move the two assemblies, the scrap on the bottom and the actual pattern on top, so they do not move. He marks where the center locations will fall because that will be needed when basting and sewing the assemblies together. Then he'll trace the other half, and when he reaches the skirt edge, he'll trace up it about 8 inches or so. Onto that pocket, be sure to label it POUT for port out and SOUT for starboard out. We'll repeat that same procedure for the forward panel. We've laid it on top of some scrap fabric, and we need to make sure that we do this to the forward or bow portion of that forward panel. Bill labels on that forward panel where the pocket actually goes there, and he's ensuring that the scrap fabric underneath it will have enough to make a 6-inch sleeve. So he marks up the sides of the skirt edge on this about 8 inches up, and then he'll mark the forward portion of this forward panel, or what we call the bow portion of the forward panel. We didn't show extending the forward edge by about 6 inches on that aft panel. Here we are showing it. You should do this to both panels. We extended that line using a flexible ruler like this because we'll need that when it comes time to pattern the 6 inches up from that line. And then we mark the center positions, and we also need to mark both our panels so we don't get confused. This is the bow pocket, so he labels it bow pocket. Here we are on the starboard side, extending that line about 6 inches or so with the flexible ruler. And we mark up the edge about 8 inches or so. Don't forget to label the pockets. The pocket will have a different release point along the crown compared to the skirt edge. This is due to the angle of the bow at those locations. Here's a quick illustration of what we'll be doing next. Using a string, we'll take measurements, and those measurements will be slightly different. When it comes time to pattern the pocket, we'll use the differences in those measurements to pattern those pockets. This probably seems very confusing, but it won't be after we show you what to do. At the center position on either the primary or secondary bow, we'll use a length of line, and we'll tape it as seen here in the video. Then at the line that we struck on the bows, we'll use a marker and mark the line there. Then we'll pull our line around to the bottom side, and directly on the bottom side of that bow, we'll place a mark on the line there as well. So we have a line at the top on the line that we struck on the bow for patterning, and a line that's directly underneath at the middle position. Now we'll take that same line and position the first mark right at the skirt edge and tape it in position so it's directly in line with the line we struck on the bows. Then we'll wrap it around that bow in a horizontal position. We'll hold it in a horizontal position and mark its midship position. So now we have 3 marks on our line after we remove it from the bows. We will save this line when it comes time to pattern the pockets. Go back to the frame and measure either on the primary or secondary bow from the center location along that frame with a soft tape measure and determine where the curve begins. For us, we believe it begins around 38 inches. Now go back to the pockets and measure from the center location with that tape measure along the line that we struck along the edge of our pattern. We want to mark that location. For us, it's 38 inches. So here Bill has determined where the 38 inches rest, and he marks the pocket at that location. We need to do that on both the starboard and port sides of both of our pockets. We will not show it for the other pocket. Now mark 2 inches inside of that skirt line that we struck on the material. We did that with a ruler that is 2 inches wide. This should be done to both sides of the pocket on both the forward pocket and the aft pocket. We drew this line about 8 inches up again. Along that line that we just struck down that's 2 inches inside the edge, we'll use our rope that indicates our release point for the pocket, and we'll mark from the center position or the center mark to the line on the inside. This indicates our release point for the side or skirt edge of our Bimini top. You'll want to do this for all of the sides of these 2 pockets, the forward pocket and the aft pocket of your 4-bow Bimini top. This adds a little bit of width to our pocket here at the curved portion of our Bimini top to allow for a better fit. To add this extra material for the release point of the pocket, we will mark it from that mark we just made on our line, ours was 38 inches, to the new mark that is on our line that we struck 2 inches inside the skirt edge. This adds a little bit of extra material at that curved portion of the pocket. We need to do that for all of our pockets, the aft pocket and the forward pocket, and we need to do it on both the starboard and port sides of those pockets. From the 38-inch mark, for us, yours may be different, to the mark on the 2-inch line that is about 5/8 inch down. Here he's marking out that inside line so that he doesn't cut it by accident. Now he'll use the Sailrite edge hot knife and he'll cut up approximately 6 to 8 inches on that inner line that we marked 2 inches from the skirt edge. Then he will place his metal ruler on the underside of the fabric so he doesn't damage the tabletop and cut along the forward edge of this pocket. We have not yet traced in 6 inches perpendicular to the edge everywhere. We've only done it to that one corner, so we still need to do that. So after this edge has been cut with the Sailrite edge hot knife, we'll do that. Do not forget to mark or to cut in about 1/4 inch at all the center locations so we do not lose those. Here we are coming to the opposite edge. This is the port side of this pocket, and then we cut up about 6 to 8 inches. Now, we didn't extend the inner line when we first drew the first pocket, so here he's just doing that now because we need to follow that line as we mark 6 inches away from that line. Using the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler, we need to mark 6 inches away from the line we originally struck for the pocket. So here he's using that ruler so that it's perpendicular to that line and marking at the 6-inch location all the way to the skirt edge, the skirt line that was 2 inches from the skirt edge. Then along the cut edge of the fabric, he uses it to mark a line 6 inches from that edge, with the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler's metal edge up against the edge of the fabric. Now at the curve where we made the marks, we use the flexible ruler here to join the marks together, creating a smooth transition all the way to our inner 2-inch line that's about 6 to 8 inches up. Follow this same procedure for both of your pockets. Here we are marking 6 inches from that cut edge, and now we come to the point where the curve takes a little bit of a shape here, and we use our flexible ruler to join the marks that we made previously using our soapstone pencil. Now we can cut out this pocket. If you have not done so, be sure to label what pocket it is. This is the aft pocket. Bill cuts away the excess at the ends, and he trims on that new line that is struck approximately 6 inches up from the forward edge, except for on the curves, obviously, because there's a little bit of excess, about 5/8 inch. We're using the Sailrite edge hot knife to do this. Along the forward and aft edge will be what we call a hang-down tail. It hangs down from the edge of the bimini, and that's what we'll be going over next. To make our tails, we need to measure the forward and aft edge of our bimini top. So here we're using a flexible tape measure and running it along the edge all the way to the center position, which is about 50 inches for us. Now we'll multiply that times 2 and add about 6 extra inches to the length, just to be sure we have enough. So we need to make 2 tails that are 6 inches wide by, for us, 106 inches long. This is some of the scrap fabric that is left over, and Bill's measuring to confirm that we can make a 106-inch length tail here. His first measurement was 72 inches. Then he measures from that mark he made on the fabric and adds 34 inches to accomplish our 106 measurement for us. Using the clear acrylic ruler, which is actually 6 inches wide, he will strike a line down the length of that fabric to make a tail that is 6 inches wide by 106 inches for our application. He needs 2 of them, so he'll put them right on top of each other. While we're doing this, we might as well measure for the skirt edge, or the facing on the skirt edge. So he goes back to the frame and measures from the primary bow to the secondary bow. Our measurement is 84 inches. Yours may be different. The facing for the side of the bimini needs to be 3 inches wide, no matter what the length of your facing is. And we need it to be the 84 inches plus about 6 inches extra. So our facing strips, 2 of them, will be 3 inches wide by about 90 inches in length. Here again, we're using some of the scrap leftover fabric and the clear acrylic ruler with a soapstone pencil. Then we'll cut out both the facing strips and the tails using the Sailrite edge hot knife. In order to make our intermediate sleeves or pockets, which are shown here in the red circle, we'll need to pattern from the forward panel's aft edge and the aft pattern's forward edge or bow edge, as highlighted in yellow. The best approach is to take one of those patterns, whether it be the forward or aft panel, and fold it so that outside surfaces are facing each other. In other words, the writing is facing each other. It's folded in half on the center line. Then measure from the center line over the 18 inches. 18 times 2 is a 36-inch wide pocket, because that's what we'll be creating. And we'll mark both sides of the fabric on the outside surfaces and the inside surfaces with the soapstone pencil. Then we'll unfold that panel and lay it on top of some scrap fabric right along the edge. Not so it's even with the edge, because that edge actually has some shape to it. Then we'll mark the center location on the scrap fabric underneath and where we marked the 18 inches from the center location on both the port and starboard side, equaling a 36-inch wide pocket. We'll trace from mark to mark, right through the center line to the opposite 18-inch mark. We're tracing the forward panel's stern or back edge, and this line is about 36 inches in length. Make sure that you mark it pout for port out and sout for starboard out, as indicated by the panel laying on top of it, and also label it forward panel or forward pocket. The creation of this pocket is a little bit easier than the forward pocket and aft pocket on the main panels. These intermediate pockets or sleeves are simply 6 inches wide, so we measure up 6 inches from each of those marks at the end of the pockets. And what we'll do is we will strike a line from mark to mark. This is a straight line. To mark the ends, we'll use the clear acrylic ruler as a 90-degree device and mark from that straight line down the sides at our 18-inch marks from the center location. We want to repeat that same procedure for the aft panel's forward edge. So this is the aft panel, and we want to pattern the forward edge of the aft panel, or the bow edge. Since this is done in exactly the same way that we did with the forward panel, we will not show all of this. After we're done patterning this intermediate sleeve or pocket, we can cut it out with the Sailrite edge hot knife. We will not show that. When we're done cutting every panel and our facing strips and our pockets and our tails, this is what you should end up with. For a labeling of each one of those patterns, we'll refer back to our illustration here. Next, we'll be sewing binding to the pockets, to both the intermediate pockets and the forward and aft pockets. That binding will go on the concave side of the forward and aft pockets and on the straight edges of the intermediate pockets. Then it will be added to all of the ends of the pockets. We're using the Sailrite Fabricator sewing machine with a 1-inch swing-away binder attached to it, and we're feeding the 1-inch Sunbrella acrylic binding through that binder. That binding is included with each of the Bimini skin kits. We always recommend checking your tension before you sew. Now Bill is feeding the pocket through the binder, being careful to pay attention to the exiting point of the binder, making sure that his fabric is pushed well within the fold there. Notice we need more tension. You can see the knots on the bottom. So Bill increases the upper tension to pull that knot up into the bottom side of the binding. He slowly sews a few more inches and then looks at the bottom side to make sure the knot's pulled up more deeply into the binding. And it is. So he'll continue to sew. Now notice that we are sewing about an 8mm long straight stitch. Not a bad idea if your sewing machine is capable of that, like the Sailrite Fabricator, but the Sailrite Ultrafeed and other sewing machines typically will do about a max of a 6mm straight stitch. We recommend sewing the maximum stitch length that your sewing machine can handle when sewing Bimini tops. One of the pockets is done, and here we're inserting a second pocket. Be sure to do some reversing at the beginning and end of your stitch to lock the stitch in place. Remember that we are sewing the concave edges of the forward and aft pocket, and of the intermediate pockets, when we get to those, we'll be sewing the straight edges of those. Now we're going to sew one of the intermediate pockets. We'll be sewing that straight edge. And we have not cut the binding. We simply just feed this in, and we'll cut it later after it's done being sewn. All of our 4 pockets will be cut apart at a later stage. And here's our last intermediate pocket. Remember to do reversing at the beginning and the end. The 1-inch swing-away binder does a phenomenal job of feeding and folding the binding on the edge of a fabric assembly. And it can be swung out of the way so you can cut your binding and apply it at different locations. Here we're cutting each one of those pockets away from the other strip of pocket and cutting away the excess binding at each edge. We are not yet using a hot knife because we need to sew a strip of binding on the ends of each of the pockets. And so that one that we cut with the scissors will basically be covered with another strip of binding. After we're done sewing the ends on, then we'll cut them flush and then use a hot knife to help seal the edge of the binding to keep it from unraveling. We like to sew past the binding a little bit and then do reversing. So notice here, Bill will sew into the binding, sew a little bit outside of the application, then he'll do some reversing to lock the stitch in place. He'll do it a couple times to make sure it does not come apart. This process is done for all of the pockets. Then we can move on. Now that the binding is sewn on, he goes back to the table and places a ruler on the bottom side and will trim each one of the ends of the binding off to make it flush with the edge of that pocket. We now need to apply the zippers to the intermediate pockets or sleeves. Here Bill is determining where the double-sided tape should be placed. The zipper goes on the side of the pocket with the writing and with the zipper's slider facing the opposite direction. So the basting tape is applied to the flange with the zipper's slider pull tab facing up, as you can see here. Using the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler assures that the basting tape is stuck well to the flange. Then he'll remove the transfer paper, revealing the double-sided tape. Then he'll baste that zipper to the intermediate pocket or sleeve. He bastes it on the side with the writing, so he just flipped it so the writing is facing down. The starter box and the starter post should be flush with the end of that pocket. He bastes the binding so that it is flush up against the teeth of the zipper. The slider gets a little bit in the way, so Bill moved it out of the way so he could baste the end of the zipper on, and it should almost be the length of that pocket. Now he will flip it back so the writing is facing up now, and use the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler to be assured that it is stuck well to our sleeve. He will remove the opposite side of the zipper and keep it because we'll need it later on. Now he'll do the same procedure for the second intermediate pocket or sleeve. Zipper is basted on the side with the writing. Sout and pout is facing the tabletop. Then he removes the other side and he will keep that as well. Now we have the zippers basted in place. We can take them to the sewing machine and sew them. We always try to sew zippers on the same side of the presser foot because presser feet widths will vary from the left side and the right side. So here Bill is sewing with the teeth to the right of the presser foot. And again, it's always important to do some reversing at the beginning and the end of your sewing, especially for zippers where there's often a lot of tension on the ends when you're trying to zip them together and unzip them. Here at the end, where the starter post is, you'll do some reversing there as well. And now that zipper is basted and sewn to our intermediate pocket. We need to do the same thing with the second intermediate pocket. Now it's a good idea to put the other side of the zipper back on those pockets, so that's what Bill is doing here. Notice our outside surfaces has two stitches, one that secured the binding and the other one that secured the zipper. We highly recommend using scrap paper in making a mock-up panel arrangement as shown here and labeling them carefully. It's now time to assemble panels, but before we do that with our paper mock-up, we want to show you a drawing that will hopefully help you to determine how it should be stapled together. We're going to start with the forward panel, center panel, and the intermediate forward sleeve. These three panels will be basted together as shown here. The forward panel's on the bottom side with its writing facing up. The center panel's in between that with its writing facing down. And then the intermediate forward sleeve is on the top with its writing facing up. Bill takes the center panel of his paper mock-up and places it so that it's upside down on top of the forward panel. Then he places the intermediate forward sleeve on top of those with its writing facing up. This is just like we showed in that illustration. Then he'll line the edges and staple it. And now he has a paper mock-up of exactly how the panels should be assembled. There are more panels to assemble, but first we will seam these together and sew them together.
Now flip it over and show me that.
Bill has laid the panels so that he can easily assemble them. Intermediate sleeve is placed between his knees to get it out of the way, and the center panel is placed over top of the forward panel. Center panel's writing is facing down. The forward panel's writing is facing up, so outside surfaces are facing each other. The sout and the pout are all on the same side. Then he lays the intermediate forward sleeve on top of that with its writing facing up. This is how these three panels will be assembled. Always check to be sure sout is on the same side of all panels, as it is shown here. Now that we know how the panels will be assembled, we need to move some of them out of the way so that we can apply the double-sided seam stick. So we can baste panels together so they're easy to take to the sewing machine and sew without moving. We're going to start at the center location and baste half of the assembly together. Because if we baste the entire assembly across its forward edge or aft edge, we will typically find that when we're sewing it, it comes apart. But doing half at a time helps to keep the panels together. Sunbrella marine grade fabric is water resistant, stain resistant, and dirt resistant, and because of that it's resistant to the seam stick basting tape. Applying pressure to the seam stick after it's applied with the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler can help to adhere the seam stick to the resistant Sunbrella marine grade fabric. You may be asking, why are we basting the other half if we've already talked about only basting a half at a time? That's because we like to apply the basting tape to all the panels but only remove the transfer paper of the basting tape on the half that we'll be basting together. So even here on the intermediate pocket we have two separate portions of seam stick, and we basted it to the side without writing because it will be basted to the top of all of the panel assemblies. We want to make sure the forward panel and the center panel are centered. So our center mark that we cut with a hot knife is directly on top of each other. And then we want to baste one half down, making sure the edges are lined up as we baste them. It doesn't matter which half we baste down first. Here we're basting the port side down. When you get to the ends, there'll be a lot of shape here, so it'll be a little bit difficult to baste it down. Your goal, line up edges and make sure there are no wrinkles as you baste the two panels together. You can expect a little dog ear at the end of the assemblies. That's the half-inch seam allowance and is expected. Be sure to use a heavy object or the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler to apply pressure to the basting tape to adhere the two panels together solidly. Next, the intermediate forward sleeve is basted in place. We remove the transfer paper from half of the seam stick on this assembly and make sure the center marks or notches are lined up directly on top of each other. Then baste it down so that its front edges are even with the panels underneath it. At the end of our assembly there is a lot of shape, and because of that it may come unbasted as we take it to the sewing machine and sew. Because of that, Bill's going to apply a few straight pins just at the corner, so 3 straight pins, and they're very close to the raw edge. That way he can hopefully sew without having to remove the straight pins. We highly recommend using the Deluxe 5.5-inch magnetic guide, and we place it a ½ inch from where the needle will penetrate the edge of the fabric. So we're creating a stitch a ½ inch from the raw edge of the fabric, and we are starting to sew at the center location of this assembly. We do some reversing at the beginning, and we will sew down one leg, the leg that was basted down. So this is the port side of the forward, the center, and the intermediate forward sleeve. This is the first stitch of a semi-flat filled seam. The first stitch is placed a ½ inch from the raw edge of the fabric. Then the assemblies are splayed apart and a top stitch will be placed on top of that, completing the semi-flat filled seam. Here Bill has reached the edge where there's a lot of shape, and he did pull one of the pins out. Sew slowly here, because you want to make sure that you do not sew any wrinkles into this ½ inch seam. So Bill is ensuring that the fabric is laying flat as he sews this area, which has a lot of shape. Here he will leave one of the pins in place because he's put it so close to the edge there that it'll basically sneak by the presser foot. If your sewing machine has a larger presser foot, you may want to remove the pin so that it doesn't run into the presser foot. Here he's ensuring that the fabric on the underside is also laying flat and the fabric on the top is laying flat as he sews this seam a half inch from the raw edge of the fabric. Take your time here. You do not want any wrinkles here. Keep that fabric up against the deluxe 5.5 inch magnetic guide and you'll have a perfect half-inch seam for your first stitch of the semi-flat felled seam. And when you reach the end, do a little bit of reversing. Now, we're not going to create the top stitch yet. First, we need to sew the other half of the assembly together. So we're going to take it back to the table and baste that half, the starboard side for us, in the same manner that we basted the port side in place. Since this process is done in exactly the same way that we already showed, we are not going to show all of this. Now we'll take this back to the sewing machine, and this time we're going to flip the assembly. So we're working from the opposite end of the assembly. We're not starting at the center position. Let's talk a little bit about sewing thread. Now, you can modify anything in any one of the Bimini kits, whether it be a skin kit or a frame kit. So just ask if you want to change anything. Going back to thread, there are two types of outdoor thread that you can choose from. Polyester, which is what we're using here, and comes standard in the Bimini skin kits. But polyester thread in a very high UV concentrated area like the tropics may only last 2 or 3 years and then rot. In a non-tropical environment, it may last 5 to 8 years. If you want a lifetime guaranteed thread that is not affected by the UVR, then pick a PTFE thread. Sailrite carries 2 brands, Tanara and Profilin. Profilin is recommended for the Sailrite Ultrafeed sewing machine. Whew, once we get by that, the sewing is a lot easier because it's basically almost like a straightaway all the way to the center position. And once we reach that middle position or the stitching where we started, we do some reversing on top of that. And now our first stitch of the semi-flat felled seam is complete. To discuss how we're going to sew the top stitch in, we're going to take this assembly to the table and look at the half-inch tail of that stitch we just created. The intermediate pocket or sleeve should be resting towards bill, and just so you know, the center panel is in bill's direction too. So we want that tail to be facing towards the forward panel, and it's facing away from bill. So the tail goes back towards the forward panel, and our top stitch will go right here where bill's pointing. All right, go ahead. We cannot use the deluxe 5.5 inch magnetic guide, so we remove that to sew the top stitch. And now we'll place our presser foot so our stitch is about 1/8 inch away from the splayed out portion of this assembly. The center panel is to our right and the forward panel is to our left. We're sewing in the forward panel, 1/8 inch from the splayed out portion of the fabric assembly. Our half-inch tail we're sewing through on the underside. In other words, the half-inch tail is folded back so it's underneath the forward panel. So we're sewing through that half-inch tail on the underside. Sew nice and slowly and pull the panels apart as you sew so that they are splayed out on that first stitch that we created. A little hint here that we did not show. If you take this assembly to the table before you sew this top stitch and you splay the panels apart and then crease them well with a heavy object like the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler, that will give it a memory and it'll be easier to sew this top stitch because you won't have to concentrate as much on splaying the panels apart because they will be creased and have a slight memory. So we'll show that when we create the second top stitch when we join the aft panel to the center panel. We'll show that a little bit later on. Bill is sewing this top stitch very slowly, and that's not a bad idea because this stitch will be very visible. Now we're using the white thread that comes in the kit, but if you prefer to use a thread that matches your fabric, which I highly recommend, just request that when you place an order for your Bimini skin kit. The Sailrite Fabricator sewing machine set up with the Sailrite Workhorse servo motor is a phenomenal package, and you'll notice throughout this video we have exceptional slow speed control. Here Bill scrolls the fabric up so he can get it underneath the arm of the sewing machine. Now this also works great with an UltraFeed LSZ1 or LS1 sewing machine. Even though the UltraFeed sewing machines are smaller than this Sailrite Fabricator sewing machine, they do an excellent job of sewing Bimini tops like this as well. Here Bill is coming to the other side. Notice how slow he goes here. And notice the slow speed control that we have with the Sailrite Fabricator sewing machine coupled with the Sailrite Workhorse servo motor. Notice the tail on the underside. It's facing to the left, and that's what we want. We want to sew through that tail. And when we get to the end, we want to do some reversing. And now that top stitch is complete, completing the semi-flat filled seam. We'll go back to our paper mock-up to see how the next set of panels are assembled. Here's the panels we just sewed together. We'll lay them down. And then we'll join the aft intermediate pocket by flipping it and placing it under the center panel's aft edge. Make sure pout and sout are all on the same side. Then we will take the aft panel and place it on top of the center panel with its outside surfaces facing down, or the writing facing down. Again, make sure souts are all on the same side and pouts are all on the same side. We'll staple it there. Now we have the top all stapled together. So we have this paper mock-up to use as a reference for basting the aft panel and the aft intermediate sleeve together. Now the intermediate sleeves look a little strange, but they'll actually, when done, be flipped so that their straight edges are going towards the forward and aft edge of the top. Here's an illustration of those three panels. Starting from the top, we have the aft panel with its writing facing down. Then at the center, we have the center panel with its writing facing up. And then on the bottom of all of those, we have the intermediate aft sleeve with its writing facing down. Our center panel already has the forward and forward intermediate sleeve sewn to it. These will now be sewn to that. This is our aft panel, and this is the forward or bow edge of that aft panel. Bill flips it upside down so the writing is facing down. The writing on the center panel is facing up. That's the panel directly under this aft panel, so outside surfaces are facing each other. Then the intermediate aft sleeve will be positioned underneath of these assemblies with its writing facing the tabletop. So we'll shove it under both those assemblies so its writing is facing the tabletop or down. Okay, now that we know how these panels are assembled, it's now time to baste them together. And we'll do them in basically the same way that we did with the forward panel into its midsection. We will baste half of the assembly together first and then take it to the sewing machine and sew our first stitch of the semi-flat filled seam. We will not show all of this since it's done in exactly the same manner as we did before. Don't get confused here with this shot. The panel's been flipped so you can see the intermediate sleeve that is actually on the underside. Now we'll place our deluxe 5.5-inch magnetic guide a half-inch away from the needle. The needle plate on the Sailrite Fabricator sewing machine has the half-inch marking already on there, so it's easy to place it without having to do any measuring. And we'll sew that first stitch a half-inch from the raw edge of the fabric, keeping the fabric lined up against the deluxe 5.5-inch magnetic guide as we sew. We will quickly go through this since this process is done exactly in the same manner as when we sewed the forward panel to the center panel. We've now reached the halfway point here. You can see that with that quarter-inch cutout in the center of our assembly. We'll do some reversing, and now we'll take it back to the table and baste the opposite half together. Don't be alarmed at the dog ear. That is expected, as we discussed earlier. The panel on the underside is actually the aft panel. Then the center panel is on top of that, and then the intermediate pocket is on top of that, because we had that assembly flipped. So again, do not get confused about that. Skipping ahead here it is all sewn with that first stitch. So all of the panels are sewn with the first stitch. Now we need to sew the top stitch. Before we take this over to the sewing machine to sew this top stitch, we want to show you a little trick here that should be done with all semi-flat felled seams. The half-inch tail or flange is facing towards the aft panel, and here Bill is splaying the panel apart and using the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler to create a fold or a memory crease in the fabric, so that when he takes it to the sewing machine and sews it, he won't have to concentrate as much on splaying the panels apart, because they will automatically have a slight memory or crease at that location. So he does that on the table before he takes it to the sewing machine. Now he can create that top stitch, and it will be easier to sew this top stitch in place and keep your stitch spaced appropriately and about an 1/8 inch away from the splayed out portion. He won't have to concentrate nearly as much on splaying the fabric out as he sews it. All he'll have to concentrate on is keeping his stitch nice and straight. Now, we didn't discuss this fact either, but it's something that should be noted, that when Bill does some adjusting of the fabric when he's sewing any kind of stitch, it's always a good idea to bury the needle at the thickest part of the shaft as you do adjustment to your fabric. In other words, if you need to scroll the fabric to get it underneath the arm of the sewing machine, always bury your needle so that you do not lose your last position. You may have already noticed him doing that, but sometimes it just needs to be said so that you do it as well. Here he's scrolling the fabric, and you can't really tell, but the needle is buried in the fabric so he doesn't lose his position. Then when he comes to the end, do some reversing. And here's what the underside of that assembly looks like. You will see 2 stitches on the underside, but only 1 stitch on the outside surface. That is a semi-flat filled seam. Now that we have all the panels sewn together, we need to concentrate on how to sew the tail and the forward and aft pockets to the aft edge and the forward edge. This is actually pretty easy. The writing on the panels is facing up, and the tails writing is facing up, and the sleeves writing is facing up, and the sout and pout are all on the same side of the assembly. We'll place one staple at the center position so you can see exactly how it goes. Same thing with the forward panel. The writing on everything is facing up, and the pout is all on the same side, and the sout is all on the same side, and then the sleeve is on top of the tail, and we'll staple that in place. So our mock-up is now complete. Even though our paper mock-up is ready, we're not going to tackle the tails and the pockets yet. First, we're going to go over steps for a backstay slit, if you have it. If your Bimini top includes a backstay slit, watch this chapter. If not, skip it. This is the aft panel, as you can see here, with it folded up. Bill will fold it back against the tabletop, so he's looking on the inside of the Bimini top. The outside surface is facing the tabletop. We'll be installing 2 backstay slits in our top. We measure over from the center position, where the notch is at the center position, to where the Bimini backstay slit is located. So measure over from that distance for your application as well. Then we like to use the Sailrite Edge hot knife and put a slit at those locations, going in about 1/4 inch so we never lose them. From the bottom edge, measure up at the location for the backstay slit to where you think the zipper will be located or fall within the Bimini top. Then measure up 4 inches past that, approximately 4 inches past that, because that's where we want the zipper to actually stop. So it has a little bit of wiggle room in case the zipper falls someplace else. Using a straight edge, we'll mark through those marks all the way to the location where the backstay slit is using the soapstone pencil. Then we'll mark the locations to where we think the zipper will be and the stop location for the zipper. Now we'll take the aft sleeve and be sure that the souts are on the same side and the pouts are on the same side. The writing is facing down. Place that sleeve at the center location of your panel underneath and then mark the location for the backstay slit on that sleeve, because we need to cut the sleeve to allow for access for the backstay slits. Ours has 2. From those marks, measure over 2 inches. So we want to create a 4-inch opening here. So 2 inches on each side equals 4 inches in total, and mark that location. Before cutting the sleeve, mark the locations where those cuts will be on the top, on both the bottom edge and the top edge, so you know exactly where it should be positioned after you cut them. So we've done that for both backstay slits. Then we'll use the hot knife again and put a notch at each one of those locations, only on the aft edge of the aft panel. Then we will place a metal ruler underneath our sleeve and cut the sleeve along those marks we just made, which are 2 inches away from where the backstay slit is marked. So we cut out the 4 inches of material. We'll throw away the 4-inch piece and keep the opposite sides. Since our Bimini top has 2 backstay slits, we need to do this twice. So now our aft sleeve is cut into 3 separate sections. We need to finish the ends of the zipper that have just been cut. So here we are installing binding on the ends. So now our aft pocket or sleeve is cut into 3 separate sections. Let's move on. Now before we can attach the tails, we need to do some prep work to the tails. So we will find the tails of the assemblies that we cut out, and we will find the center locations. To do this, we'll fold it in half. We'll do that for both of these tails. Then we'll mark the center locations with the Sailrite edge hot knife by cutting in 1/4 inch on each edge, so we know where the center is. Then these tails are folded down their length right in half, so instead of being 6 inches, they are now 3 inches in width. You can crease it with a Sailrite canvas patterning ruler, or you can crease it on the edge of a sharp table that is sacrificial. This is a little bit easier than using the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler, just because you can keep the assembly's edges nice and neat as you fold it, and you can create the crease at the same time. So we recommend doing it on the edge of a table like that. We will then apply basting tape right along the crease that we made at the center location on one side or the other, it doesn't matter which. And then we will apply basting tape as well to the outside edge, doesn't matter which outside edge. So 2 runs of basting tape, which will help to secure our tail in place so it doesn't move on us when we finally take it to the Bimini top and sew it in place. After it's basted in place, we'll run it along the edge of a table again to adhere it very well so it doesn't come unbasted. Notice that the tail takes a curve or a convex shape. We want to seam or sew it onto the top with the raw edges being sewn in place, and the fold will be on the outside, so Bill has marked it seam at that location. Now we can install the tail and the sleeves, or sometimes referred to as pockets. Bill positions the Bimini top so that the forward panel is facing him and the outside surfaces are facing up. The bow pocket or forward pocket goes on the forward panel, and be sure that the souts and pouts are on the same side as each other. Then apply basting tape to the forward edge of the forward panel, breaking it at the center location because we're going to baste and sew half of it at a time, just as we did earlier. Then we'll take the tail and apply basting tape to it as well, breaking it at the center location as well. At the center location of the forward pocket or bow pocket, transfer your center mark to the edge that has binding on it. Then create two lines opposite it, about a finger apart on both sides. At that center location is where the zipper will start, about a finger away from the center location on the starboard side and port side. Here Bill is marking the zipper where he wants to apply the seam stick basting tape on the flange. Starter boxes are typically positioned at the center location, so he applies basting tape to that and basically breaks it where he thinks it's going to basically come to the end of that pocket. And now he'll baste it to the side that has the writing. So the writing is now facing the tabletop. And he will baste the zipper starting at the center location where the starter box and post are for the zipper. And he will place it on top of that mark that is one finger away from the center location and start basting it in place there. The binding is run right along the zipper's teeth, and then when you get to the transition that has a lot of shape, there'll be some shape in the sleeve. As you can see, it's canted up there. That is normal and expected. After basting the zipper in place, use a tool like the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler to apply pressure to the assembly for a good bond. Then you can cut the excess off now or later after it's sewn. Just be sure to leave a little bit of excess. The starboard side is basted. Now we need to baste the port side, and we will do that in the same manner, starting it one finger away from the center position. This random space at the center location just will allow for easier zipping and unzipping. Now we'll take it over and sew that as zipper to the sleeve. We start here at the end and do some reversing to lock our stitch in place. Do several reverse stitches here because we don't want that zipper to come unsewn to the pocket. Then we will sew carefully, keeping the right portion of the presser foot right up against the zipper's teeth to create a nice straight stitch. Remember, the stitch on the bottom side will be visible with the stitch of the binding. Do some reversing when you come to the end of the zipper, being sure to secure it well in place. And notice the presser foot is canted slightly as it goes by the starter box, because the starter box is a little bit wider than the zipper's teeth. Once we get past the starter box, we can cant the assembly a little bit closer to the presser feet again so that we are right up against the teeth, keeping that stitch nice and straight. Okay, now that the zipper's been sewn in place, we can baste the assemblies together. First, we'll start with the tail. We basted half of the tail to the forward panel's edge. After the tail's basted in place, we'll then baste the sleeve directly on top of the tail. Notice that the writing on the sleeve and the zipper are facing up, and be sure the sout and pout are on the correct side of all the assemblies. And the sleeve will be a little bit shorter than the skirt edge of the Bimini, and that's expected. Remove any excess basting tape on the tail that may be exposed. You should have a few inches of that. We didn't show it, but we already sewed the starboard side, and now we're sewing the pout side. It has also been basted down. So we sewed this in two separate passes, going to the center position, which we are coming upon now. Once we pass over those previous stitches, we will do some reversing, and that's the first step of our semi-flat felled seam. We'll take the Bimini top back to the table, and we will unfold the pocket so it is facing forward. Now we will help splay that first stitch apart, and we'll use the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler to crease it so it has a little bit of a memory, so we can take it back to the sewing machine and sew it with much more ease, because it will basically take shape there. We want the flange, the 1/2 inch flange on the underside, to be facing in towards the Bimini top as we fold the assembly and crease it well. At the corner, there's a lot of shape here, so Bill is working diligently to splay it apart and to crease it so it's directly on top of that first stitch. Now he takes it back to the sewing machine and will sew a top stitch about an 1/8 inch away from the splayed seam, or the first seam that was sewn. And this stitch is sewn into the forward edge of the Bimini top, not into the tail. We are catching the 1/2 inch flange on the underside, though you cannot see that here. So take your time and sew carefully so your stitch is nice and straight, because everyone will see this stitch. And here we are coming to the end. We'll do some reversing there. The tail should be longer, as it is seen here. We'll trim that later on. The aft edge of our Bimini includes 2 backstay slits, so our aft sleeve includes 3 separate sections. If yours does not include any backstay slits, you will do it exactly the same as you did for the forward sleeve. Since our aft sleeve is cut into 3 separate sections, we'll need to order another zipper that's not included in the kit. Order a number 10 Vislon YKK zipper with a single pull locking slider. Zippers will be basted to the side of the pocket that has the writing, and the slider's pull tab will be facing on the side that does not have the writing. Here Bill is cutting the extra length off the zipper. Be careful about doing this. He actually almost cuts this one too short. Be sure you leave enough extra, or don't cut them until they're actually sewn in place. Here he leaves plenty of excess. A straight run is easy to determine, but anything that takes a slight curve typically requires more zipper. Then he places basting tape on the flange of the zipper, the appropriate flange in this situation, so that it can be basted to the side of the pocket that has the writing, and the slider's puller tab is facing on the side that does not have the writing on the pocket. You may notice at the beginning of this chapter some of the ends don't have binding sewn on them yet. We covered that in a previous chapter, so yours would have that done. Now we can baste the zippers to those pocket sections. This is done just in the same way that we basted the zippers to the intermediate sleeves earlier. This zipper is a little bit too long, but we're not going to cut it until it's been sewn. And now we'll apply the zippers for the starboard and port sides of this pocket. Please note that if your aft pocket does not have any backstay slits, your pocket will be one continuous piece with 2 zippers, like we did in the previous chapter when we did the forward pocket. These sleeves or pockets at the corners have a lot of shape in them, and so your sleeve will actually be canted up, as you can see here in the video. That is normal and expected. The zipper has been basted to the side of the pocket that has the writing. In other words, for this one, pout. Once the zipper is basted onto all the sections of our aft sleeve, we can take it to the sewing machine and sew it. Be sure to do some reversing at the beginning and carefully and consistently sew the same distance from the teeth by keeping the presser foot up against the teeth as you sew. And do reversing when you reach the other end. This zipper is a little bit too long, but we'll cut it after we're done. Follow that same procedure for all the sections of your aft sleeve or pocket. At the starter box, you'll notice that the presser foot is canted slightly. That's in an effort just to get by the starter, which is a little bit bigger than the teeth. Then when the presser foot comes up against the teeth, we run it right alongside the teeth again, just as we did earlier. Notice here, Bill almost cut the zipper too short. That's why it's probably a good idea to cut the zipper after you've sewn it in place. But it'll work. Here again, we run up to the box and we have to cant the presser foot slightly to get past the box so we can sew a reverse stitch there. Now all three of our sections of aft sleeve have been sewn with zippers. The process for installing the aft sleeve and the aft tail is the same as it was for the forward tail and sleeve. However, our aft panel includes 2 backstay slits, so our pockets are cut into 3 separate sections, which we did earlier. Since the process is the same, we're going to go through this rather quickly, but just be assured that you have each one of those sections for this aft sleeve at the right spot. So make sure pout and pout are all lined up and sout and sout are all lined up. Before the sleeves can be basted down, we need to baste the tail in place. The raw edge will match the raw edge of the top, and it will be basted down to that top, and then the sleeves will go on top of it. We will apply basting tape to the top, starting at the center position so we can sew 1/2 at a time. As with any basting tape, we recommend using a tool like the Sailrite Canvas Patterning Ruler to be assured that the basting tape is bound well to the fabric. Now we'll apply basting tape to the tail's edge because we need to adhere the sleeves to the top of it. So basting tape is applied to the Bimini top edge where the tail will be applied, and then basting tape is applied to the tail where the sleeves will be applied. We will baste a half section at a time. If you do not have a backstay slit, or in our situation 2 of them, your sleeve will be one continuous piece. Here we need to match up the sleeve that is on the port side to the mark we made earlier, right? Not at the backstay slit, but the mark 2 inches away from the backstay slit. So here Bill is moving or transferring that mark to the top side of the Bimini so he can see it. He'll do the same for the second backstay slit. The marks are transferred to the top side so that he knows exactly where this sleeve should be basted. Just as we did on the other side, the sleeves are basted so the writing is facing up, and the writing of the top is facing up as well. In this scenario, the middle portion of that sleeve goes past our middle position, or middle mark. No big deal. We're going to baste the entire portion of that sleeve down and sew it starting at the end of that sleeve, since the backstay slit cut it into 3 separate sections. So here Bill is going to rip the transfer paper off the top of the basting tape, revealing the portion that will baste down our sleeve. Now, because we went past the center position, we also need to peel up the transfer paper that will baste down our tail, because we don't want to sew through that transfer paper. We want to sew through the double-sided tape. So here we're basting down the tail up to that point, and we will rip our transfer paper there, leaving the other half, or a little bit less than half, still unbasted. Now the remainder of the sleeve on the port side, starting at the position that is 2 inches away from our backstay slit, where we marked it. Any seam stick that is exposed should be removed. The seam stick at the 4-inch opening for the backstay slit should also be removed there. Now we can take this over to the sewing machine. We will install our deluxe 5.5-inch magnetic guide so that it's a 1/2 inch away from the needle, following the needle plate for the fabricator sewing machine. And we'll start sewing not at the center position, but actually where that middle sleeve starts, because we have 2 backstay slits. Now, if you have a panel or a sleeve that runs the continuous length, then you would just start at one end and sew to the center position. or start at the center position and sew to the end, whichever side you basted down. And here we are coming to the end. We will again sew past our sleeve and into the tail and stop sewing where the panel begins or ends. We'll take the Bimini top back to the table and baste the opposite half in the same manner. We're going to skip ahead to the sewing portion of this. So here we are starting from one of the ends and sewing into the tail. We did some reversing at the beginning, and now we're sewing into that portion of the sleeve. We will not do any reversing there. We'll just sew through the sleeve and up to the point where we started sewing near the middle position. And we're a ½ inch away from the raw edge of the fabric. Oh, here we forgot to remove the basting tape between the backstay slit. We just did that now. We will do some reversing right here, and this completes the first stitch of our semi-flat felled seam. Back on our table again, we will now fold the pockets forward towards Bill and the tail, and we will crease it with the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler so that the panel is splayed nicely against the first stitch. And it has a slight memory, so it's easier to sew. The ½ inch flange on the underside is again facing towards the Bimini top, so it'll be splayed towards the top and not towards the tail or the sleeve. Now we'll sew the top stitch. The top stitch goes into the Bimini top edge and is sewing through the ½ inch flange on the underside. We do some reversing at the beginning and keep our stitch about an ½ inch away from the splayed out portion of the Bimini top, right where the tail joins the Bimini top. Because Bill worked diligently to splay the fabric at the table and to crease it well with the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler, he doesn't have to worry or concentrate as much on splaying the fabric apart as he sews it. He just has to be concerned about guiding it so the stitch looks nice and straight. The Sailrite Fabricator sewing machine with the workhorse servo motor is a phenomenal sewing machine package. You can order it at Sailrite. Bill is a very careful and very slow sewer, and that's okay because he's very precise about what he does. Onto the skirt edge, a facing strip is applied to the inside. This facing strip reinforces the sides of the bimini and also allows for possible future enclosure zippers to be sewn to it. Now we'll take the facing strips that we cut earlier and we'll apply basting tape to one long edge and then create approximately a ½ inch hem along that edge. So we're basting a ½ inch hem along one of the long edges. We will do that to both of the facing strips. And we'll use a Sailrite canvas patterning ruler to adhere it well. Then we'll place double-sided tape on top of that ½ inch hem and run it down the long length of the facing strip. We will then apply basting tape to the opposite side, the side without the hem. So we have 2 strips of basting tape running along the length of both facing strips. The facing strips are now basted to the sides of the bimini top, though they are typically tucked under some of the semi-flat felled seam or the ½ inch flange. So here Bill is marking where he will cut it, and he will cut it slightly on the outside of that line so that he can tuck it a little bit underneath of that ½ inch flange that creates our semi-flat felled seam. He cuts it with the Sailrite edge hot knife. Since the sides of our bimini is not actually straight, but at each section where the panels are joined together it takes a different shape, we will cut it at that junction. So we marked it where the seam was that joins this panel to the center panel, and we will tuck the end underneath that flange slightly, it doesn't go in there very deep, and run it along the edge of the bimini top, basting it in place. Since the side is not perfectly straight, it will not be easy to just baste one long strip. That's why we slit it at each one of the seams, so that we could run a second piece, which is basically straight on the center panel, in a different slight cocked angle. Notice that second strip is not quite even on the hemmed side, so Bill will actually make a modification so that it is even. Now the bottom edge will not be totally even with the edge of the Bimini top, so later on Bill will cut that so that it matches. So notice the Bimini top, it's slightly protruding. He will cut that excess off so that when he sews the binding, it's basically flush. The 4-bow Bimini has 3 panels, so we will have 3 strips of facing on each side of the Bimini, the starboard side and the port side. So here he's marking for that third strip because it too has a side that's slightly canted from the center panel. He will cut that to size and cut the end off and tuck it under the flange of the semi-flat felled seam. Now he's going to fold the fabric so he can cut the excess that is hanging over the edge slightly with the Sailrite edge hot knife. It's just slightly off. You want that edge to be nice and straight, so it doesn't matter if you cut on the Bimini top itself or if you cut the facing strip slightly. Here he's going to cut a little bit off of the Bimini top just so it matches the facing strip edge. Be careful not to burn your Bimini top. He's holding that knife very close to it. Now we'll take this over to the sewing machine and sew right along that 1/2 inch hem, about an 1/8 inch away from the folded edge of that hem. Bill starts it right on the top stitch of the seam that joined the tail and the sleeve together, and he did some reversing there at the beginning. He will sew down its length, trying to be careful to keep the stitch nice and straight as he sews. We'll want to follow this same procedure for the opposite side of the Bimini top. We will not be showing that. When he gets to the other end, he will do some reversing, trying to sew right into that top stitch. So the stitch stops immediately at that location because it really looks better that way from the outside, because you're going to see this stitch and you're going to see the top stitch. So having the stitch land right on top of it or as close as possible actually looks pretty good from the outside. He's using the reverse lever to determine where the needle will penetrate the fabric. You can do that to determine where the needle will stop. It's not a bad idea to do that and get in the practice of it. It's now time to sew the zippered portion of the sleeve to the Bimini top. So here Bill is folding the sleeve over so that it's directly on top of the Bimini top. And then he carefully smooths down the section at the center location, and with the soapstone pencil he marks the ends of the zipper's flange and where the flange is resting. You must do that with the sleeve nice and flat. Now he will fold the sleeve back towards him, and he'll take a measurement from the first stitch of our semi-flat felled seam to that mark. It measures 6.5 inches for us. We will now use that tape measure and measure from the first stitch that's closest to Bill 6.5 inches about every 3 to 4 inches along that seam. And the marks must be laid in a parallel manner to the skirt edge as you go along making the measurements. Here's an illustration to demonstrate what we mean by keeping the tape measure parallel to the skirt edge. After it's marked, we'll be joining the lines together. When you get to the ends that have a lot of shape, you'll need to be careful to lay the fabric as flat as possible, and again try to keep that tape measure parallel to the skirt edge or the side of the Bimini. So here we're measuring at 6.5 all along the outer stitch or the first stitch closest to Bill. Continue to do this until you reach the facing's edge where the 1/2 inch hem was created, and lay your fabric down as flat as possible when you get to that point, because again, a lot of shape causes for a lot of wrinkles. Notice that at the corner of the tape it's on the stitch, and we'll do that until we reach the facing's edge. One more mark. Then what we'll do is we'll use a straight edge to join between the marks. And if the marks deviate, in other words, if there's shape in it, we will mark from mark to mark. Here it's a straight line. But when we get to the outer edge, it becomes more of a transitional line or a curved line. So we have to stop there. And what we'll do is we'll use a flexible ruler like this or another object to trace or join the lines together to make a smooth transition. Mark it with a soapstone pencil as we are here. We didn't show doing it on the other side, but here it is complete, and we're just simply joining up the lines. And we're finishing up that side as well with a flexible ruler. Follow this process for the forward portion of the forward panel and the aft portion of the aft panel. Do not do this for the intermediate sleeves. We'll do something different with those. Now we'll apply basting tape to the flange of the zippers so that we can baste it to the top of the Bimini. Be sure to use the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler or something similar to adhere the basting tape well to the flange of the zipper. We'll do that for both zippers for this pocket. We like to begin basting at the sides where the facing was sewn to the Bimini top. And we like the end of the pocket to be about 2 fingers away from the edge of the Bimini. We will only baste down about 6 or 8 inches worth of zipper at that end. Then we'll use a multi-use pin and pin the end of the zipper at that junction into the facing. Now do not continue to baste from the side. Instead, transition to the center position or where the zipper starts. If you have a backstay slit, it may start someplace different. And start basting it there, following the line that you struck on the Bimini top material. This will be rather easy as it's mostly a straightaway here. There is a little bit of shape, so you do have to follow that line. But when you get to the side, there's a lot of shape, and we'll have to do some special things here. So here you can see there's a lot of excess zipper flange. What we'll do is we'll try to distribute the excess between the portion that is pinned and the portion that is already basted down. So we'll try to distribute the wrinkles and make them as small as possible and still match up the zipper's flange to the line that we struck on the Bimini top. Bill's doing a pretty good job of working out the majority of the wrinkles. Now there's a big wrinkle right before the pin, so he's going to unbaste some of that and distribute that wrinkle along that curved portion of the zipper. That looks pretty good. Now, if you take something like the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler and start to work out some of those wrinkles, they actually almost disappear. Kind of cool here. And they'll also disappear a little bit more when you take it to the sewing machine and sew the assembly. So, basting it down hard like this with a hard object helps, and also sewing it will help those wrinkles to disappear. We recommend that you mark the zipper's flange and the top with match-up marks about every 8 to 12 inches. This way, if the zipper comes unbasted, you can make sure that it matches up to the marks that you struck on the material, because the zipper is really in the perfect spot right now. So when we take it to the sewing machine, if it moves on us, we can line it up with the line that we struck on the material and line it up with the match-up marks. So here we are sewing that zipper. We haven't basted the other side yet. We are only sewing one zipper at a time here, and we want to do some reversing, being careful not to sew into the Bimini top, because we are only sewing through one layer of Sunbrella marine grade fabric, so no reason to put a hole in the top unless it's reinforced with more material. That way it helps to prevent leakage. So Bill was very careful to do reversing and try to stay within the zipper's flange when he did his reversing. So now he will carefully sew so his presser foot's up against the teeth, and he will observe to make sure that the zipper does not come unbasted and his match-up marks are right where they need to be, especially when he gets to the curvy portion of the top where there is a lot of shape and there are wrinkles. So here he's using his scissors instead of the canvas patterning ruler just to adhere the zipper down because it's wanting to come away from the Bimini top because of all the excess shape. And the matchup marks are still made perfectly, so he'll be good there. Notice the few small wrinkles at this corner and how after it's sewn they kind of disappear. That's what we were discussing earlier. Oftentimes sewing through an application that has to take a slight bend like this will help the wrinkles of the zipper's flange to disappear. Now when we get to the facing, what we will do is we will sew into the facing to the stitch of the facing and do some reversing. That facing will help reinforce the back tack stitching or the reverse stitching that we'll do, which will basically reinforce the zipper at that location. By sewing through the facing strip a little bit and reversing there, this provides more excess strength to the stitch that secures the zipper at the end of the bimini or edge. You will repeat this process for all of the zipper sleeves for the forward edge and the aft edge. Here we are working on the aft edge, though that zipper sleeve is cut into 3 separate sections to accommodate for 2 backstay slits. But the process is done exactly in the same way. So we will not go into detail about how we do this because it's the same, except for the fact that we have 3 zippers instead of 2 on this side. If you do not have any backstay slits, you will only have 2 zippers on 1 sleeve. We're going to skip ahead a little bit here and just show basting the zippers on one of the ends here for this aft sleeve. So we apply basting tape. Then we baste the end 2 fingers away from the edge of the bimini at the facing's edge. Then we pin that in place so it doesn't move. Then we move to where the starter box and starter pin are, and we baste it on top of the line that we struck onto the bimini top, basting all the way to where the transition or curve begins and distribute the wrinkles. This time we basted everything in place, and now we'll take it to the sewing machine and sew. But hopefully nothing will move on us when we get it to the sewing machine, and if it does, we'll use our matchup marks and rebaste it in place. We will not show all of this since it's done in exactly the same way. The one part that we want to show is when we get to a break in the zipper. And here's what we'll do. We'll do some reversing without sewing through the bimini top because we do not want to make a hole in a single layer of Sunbrella if we can avoid it. Moving ahead, here we're coming to the end of that middle zipper. This edge has 3 zippers to accommodate for 2 backstay slits, and we will do some reversing right at the end of the pocket, so right here. Don't worry about the zipper being too long, we'll trim that later on. And continue to sew until you reach the other end. Now we'll work on cutting the zippers to size. We want the zippers to basically end at the end of the pockets. So here he's marked the pocket where it should be cut, he's marked the zipper where it should be cut, and he cuts it with scissors. Notice he moved the slider back, and now he will insert zipper stops that come in the kit. These are stainless steel stops right over the last tooth, or the second to the last tooth if you prefer, with needle nose pliers or pliers as seen here. That zipper's end is unraveling slightly. We should use a hot knife on it. I'm not sure if we show that in the video, but we do use a hot knife on it eventually. For any of the zippers that we cut short, we need to remove the slider because we'll be using those for these sleeves. And we will cut that zipper so it's even with the end of the sleeve with scissors or a hot knife. You can do that with a hot knife if you like, but if you do it with a hot knife, you have to be careful not to melt the teeth so much that the slider won't slide on. We will unzip this zipper all the way to the starter box and post and put the slider on the side that has the starter box, not the post. These are locking sliders, so they only go on if the slider is pulled. There is a lock in the middle. So they will not move unless the slider's pull tab is pulled upon. And on both sides of this zipper, we will also install stainless steel zipper stops that come in the kit. These stops will prevent the slider from coming off the end of the zipper. Now we'll use the hot knife and touch up the ends. So we do show this in the video. Be careful not to burn your umbrella. So do this very carefully. But this will prevent the ends of the zipper from unraveling. Sewing the intermediate zippers to the top is done slightly differently, but almost the same. It's next. To sew the zippers for the intermediate pockets, we will lay the pocket as flat as possible and mark the ends of the zipper's flange. Here we're marking a little bit away from the slider's puller because it distorts where the flange actually rests. Then we'll go back to our rope or line that has the 3 marks on it. And the first mark to the middle mark is our pocket's release point. So we mark it at the middle mark. We'll do that on both of the ends where we marked where the zipper rested with the pocket laying flat. So this is basically moving the zipper back about an inch. Then from those new marks, which are closer to the seam that secures the zipper, we will strike a line straight across from mark to mark. We'll follow that same procedure for the other intermediate pocket. And then we'll apply basting tape to the flange of the zipper. It should be basted down to that line that we struck, which is about an inch away from the initial lines, and so that the zipper starter is right in line with the end where we indicated it should start. There we go. Notice that the pockets, both of them, the intermediate pockets, are being folded back towards the forward panel and the aft panel, not the center panel. These zippers now need to be sewn down, and they're kind of in the middle of the Bimini top, but we can still feed the material through the throat of the sewing machine and get to these zippers rather easily, even if you have a smaller sewing machine like the Sailrite Ultrafeed LSZ1 or LS1 sewing machine. And we'll sew those zippers down just like we did with the other zippers. However, since we don't want to cut off the factory stops, we're going to leave the slider in place. And sewing up next to the slider is almost nearly impossible. So what we'll do is we'll stop short and bury our needle in the fabric, lift our presser foot, and pull the slider away in the opposite direction of where it's already been sewn. Then we'll lower our presser foot and continue to sew. That way we don't have to sew past the slider. We wanted to show Bill scrolling the material a little bit to get it underneath the arm of the sewing machine. That is expected, no matter what type of sewing machine you own. And when Bill comes to the end of the zipper, he's being very careful not to sew into the single layer of Sunbrella marine grade fabric. So he's trying to stay within the zipper's flange, doing some reversing here. To sew the second intermediate panel zipper, he scrolls the material on the floor as tightly as he can. A second helper would be helpful in that, but this works. To sew this zipper, he's removed the other side of the zipper. It's probably a good idea to do this. There's no excess bulk pulling on the zipper that's just basted down. Here he's coming up to the slider, so he's buried his needle, lifts his foot, moves the slider. It is a locking slider, so you do have to pull on the tab, and then we'll continue to sew to the end. Let's move on. These 36-inch zippers have a little flange at the end of the manufacturer's stop. We'll cut it off with a Sailrite edge hot knife with a ruler on the underside to prevent damage to the actual Sunbrella marine grade fabric. If your Bimini includes a backstay slit or two, you need to watch this chapter. If not, skip it. To begin the process of the backstay slit, measure from the edge of the tail up to the stop point. For us, it's 23 inches. As a reinforcing strip, we're going to use vinyl on the underside. We're using a 3-inch wide Sailrite strip of fabric here, and that strip of fabric needs to be 2 inches longer than our stop point. Our stop point was 23 inches, so this is cut at 25 inches. Sailrite has a shiny side, and on that side we'll apply 2 runs of double-sided tape. Then on the dull side, we'll strike a line right down the middle of the 3-inch wide tape. Since we have 2 backstay slits, we're making 2 of these. On the outside of our Bimini top, we need to make a zipper plaque panel, and that will be 6 inches wide, made from the same material as the Bimini top, and it'll be from our stop point plus 3.5 inches. So for us, we're making a 6-inch by 26.5-inch panel. We're using the clear acrylic ruler, which is 6 inches wide, which makes it perfect for this zipper plaque, and we'll make it our required 26.5 inches, as you can see here. Now we can cut it out with a Sailrite edge hot knife. Since we have 2 backstay slits, we need to make 2 of these. Onto that sunbrella fabric on one end, measure over 1 inch and strike a line. Then on the other end, measure over 2.5 inches and strike a line on the same side of the fabric. Then fold that sunbrella fabric in half so the lines are on the outside, and crease it well. Take the sunbrella zipper plaque panels to the sewing machine and position the deluxe 5.5-inch magnetic guide 3/4 of an inch away from the needle. Starting at the end, which has the 1-inch mark, sew down its length, doing no reversing at that end. When you reach the 2.5-inch mark, do some reversing right behind that mark, about an inch or so. So an inch of reversing right up to that mark. Then sew down its remainder length without doing any reversing at the end. This stitch is 3/4 of an inch away from the fold. If you have 2 backstay slits, you'll want to do the same thing with the second zipper plaque. With a pair of shears, we will cut directly on top of the fold, all the way from one end to the other end. This will splay our zipper plaque open in a future step. At the stop point, this is the underside of the Bimini top, we'll strike a T that is at least 5 or 6 inches long, right at the stop point. Our stop point is 23 inches for us. Then we'll continue the straight line of the backstay slit through the tail and also past our stop point. To extend the line above the stop point, we need to extend it about 3 to 4 inches so we can tell where the middle of the backstay slit is, so we know where to position the vinyl. Another option for this vinyl strip instead of Sailrite is Naugahyde Universal or Naugahyde All-American. You can use those if you want to try to match colors better. Position your vinyl strip so that it is directly on top of the backstay slit line, starting at the tail and going all the way up to the stop point, past it. Be sure that it is centered and then baste it in place. We'll strike a line on top of the vinyl at the stop point. We're using a grease pencil for that, since the soapstone pencil does not mark well on vinyl fabrics. The following is a sewing tip. Here we're going to strike a line so we can sew directly on top of it, and that line is about an 1/8 inch away from the center line or the backstay slit. We'll do that on both sides of this assembly. This line will make it a little bit easier for us to sew a straight line up both sides of the slit, because we can use it as a reference to be sure that our stitch is nice and straight. Because the Bimini top is rather large, there's a lot of fabric that we have to feed underneath the throat of the sewing machine, and having a line struck on the vinyl like that will make it easier for us to guide the fabric as we try to push the assembly through the throat of the sewing machine, so we highly recommend it. At the tail, do a little bit of reversing right on top of that line that we struck, about an 1/8 inch from the center line, which will be slit in a later step. So we did some reversing here, and now Bill will carefully guide the stitch so it's directly on top of that line that he struck on the vinyl material. We have not done anything with the zipper plaque yet. First, we are sewing down this vinyl strip. The idea of the vinyl strip here and these stitches beside the slit that we'll be making is to reinforce that slit and to also help prevent the sunbrella marine grade fabric from raveling too much. This vinyl will help to reinforce that fabric, since sunbrella doesn't necessarily like to be left raw. So here at the stop point, we will do a little bit of reversing there. And then what we can do is we can actually come across the T or do what Bill's going to do. He's actually going to stop sewing here and then reposition the fabric back at the tail and sew down the other side of the slit. Yes, I know, I hear you right now. It's not slit. Yes, it will be in the future. So what I'm referring to is a future slit. Same procedure. Now he needs to also create a good stitch at the T or the stop point. So you can either bury your needle and lift your presser foot and rotate your assembly around, which is what we highly recommend you do, and then do some reversing at the T as well. But that reversing will only be from stitch line to stitch line, so it's very small. Notice the incredible slow speed control that you have with the Sailrite fabricator sewing machine coupled with the workhorse servo motor. No matter if you have the Sailrite fabricator sewing machine or the Sailrite ultrafeed sewing machine, use the reverse lever to position the stitch exactly where you want it. By moving the reverse lever or the link lever up and down, you will be able to position the needle right where you want that stitch to be created. We need a finished number 10 YKK Vislon zipper for the Backstay Slit, and it needs to be a little bit longer than the zipper stop point. Basting tape was applied to the flange on both sides on the opposite side of the zipper's pull tab. And we're going to cut off the stops of this finished zipper so they can remove the pull tab. Don't throw it away, we'll need it later on. In fact, we'll need 2 locking single pulls per Backstay Slit. Some of the materials for this Backstay Slit operation are not included in the Bimini skin kits. A full materials list is found at the end of this video. Now, crease the splayed open portion of your zipper plaque, and Bill's doing that with the edge of a table. This is a sewing tip and sometimes not necessary. Bill's applying seam stick for basting tape on the underside of the splayed out portion of the zipper plaque so he can baste it in place so it lays nice and flat when he takes it to the sewing machine. He does that to both sides. Not a bad idea. Now, don't worry too much about the unraveling of the zipper plaque. It'll basically be covered with the zipper and really won't be visible after you're done. But if you'd like, you can touch it up with a hot knife. It's your choice. Now remove the basting tape from the flange of the zipper and baste it directly over the sewn portion. In other words, the sewn half should be right down the center of the zipper's teeth. And the starter box needs to be on our 1-inch line that we struck earlier on the sunbrella fabric. So make sure the starter box and starter pin are directly on top of that 1-inch line. Then center the zipper and baste it in place. Now we can take this zipper plaque to the sewing machine and sew the zipper down. We will start on the end that has the starter box and pin, and we'll do some reversing in the sunbrella, and we'll also do some reversing on the end of the zipper right directly across from the starter box. So this will strengthen the zipper at this point because there will be a little bit of stress on the zipper here. So we have to cant the presser foot slightly to get past the starter box. But once we are up against the teeth, we just run the presser foot right along the teeth, creating a straight stitch all the way down its length until we reach the other end. And then we do some reversing in this umbrella there. Now don't worry about doing any reversing at the end of the zipper, just at the end of this umbrella as seen here. We've discussed this once earlier on in the video, but it's always a good idea to sew on the same side of the presser foot. So here we're starting from the other end, and we'll repeat that process, obviously doing reversing at this end, and then when we get to the starter box, do some reversing across from the starter box, and then when we get to the end of the assembly, we'll do some reversing there. So same procedure, just reversed. Nice. On the end that has the 2.5-inch mark, we will transfer those marks to the opposite side, in other words, the side that will be visible from the zipper top, and then find the position across the portion that we sewed and mark it. Using a seam ripper, we will open up the portion that we sewed earlier all the way to the 2.5-inch point and stop. This opens up that zipper plaque to reveal the zipper, and you can clean up these threads just by pulling them out. Then open up the zipper all the way to the starter box. This seams backwards, so be sure that you pay attention. The slider gets put on so the slider's tab is on the side with the zipper, not on the side that's finished. So the tab is facing up as seen here. That's the appropriate way to do it. Then slide it almost to the other end and install a second slider with its fat end going down. So the fat ends of the slider will be facing each other. Remember, these are locking sliders, so they only move if the tab is pulled. On the side that has the zipper sewn to it, we will apply basting tape down both long edges. Then we will fold those edges to the zipper plaque's flange edge. So the edge of the fabric is right up against the flange edge of the zipper, and create a single hem. We'll do that to both sides. This should result in a zipper plaque that is 3 inches wide. On the 2.5-inch side, or the side without the starter box for the zipper, we will put some basting tape. We did 2 rows of basting tape there, and we will fold that back to the 2.5-inch mark that we placed on that fabric. So it will sandwich the zipper's end. Now we will take this over to the sewing machine and we will sew from stitch line to stitch line, doing some reversing. We are sewing not only through this umbrella fabric, but a little bit into the zipper's teeth, or over the zipper's teeth. This will create a great stop and also a finished zipper plaque at the end. So we are not sewing past the stitch marks. That's why we're using the reverse lever, to ensure that we are positioning the needle right where we want it, and we'll do several rows of a reverse over the zipper's teeth. Now we'll take it back and apply basting tape down both long edges. This basting tape will baste it to the Bimini top. Another sewing hint: using the soapstone pencil here, Bill will strike a soft line that he can use as his guide for sewing this zipper plaque to the Bimini top. This will make it easier for him to use as a guide to keep that stitch nice and straight. He'll do that on both long sides of the zipper plaque, about 1/8 inch away from the fold. Now he'll flip the Bimini top so its outside surfaces are facing up. He feels for the vinyl on the underside, and he will use soapstone pencil or chalk, and he will make a chalk outline so that he knows exactly where the vinyl is on the underside. Don't worry, most of these markings will come off because a soapstone pencil or chalk will eventually wear away. The zipper plaque will now be basted on top of that assembly, directly over the vinyl on the underside. So he removes the transfer paper of the double-sided tape, revealing the glue. Now, the zipper's tabs need to be facing away from each other, because if they're on top of each other, they're too bulky and it creates too much of a hump. So the zipper tabs are going in opposite directions on the underside. Then he carefully bastes it so it's directly on top of the vinyl, or the outline that he made. The zipper's starter box end is near the end of the tail. He will use the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler to be assured that it is bound or stuck well to the Bimini top. Now he'll take it over to the sewing machine and he'll use the line that he struck on the zipper plaque as a guide to keep his stitch nice and straight. Do some reversing at the tail here. Binding will be sewn at the ends, so the ends will be covered with binding in a future step. Having that line struck on the zipper plaque actually makes this process a lot easier. No longer does he have to worry as much about, is he staying a consistent distance from the edge of the zipper plaque while he has to manipulate all this fabric underneath to throw to the sewing machine? Yes, he can tell exactly where he needs to sew. Now, when he reaches the end, he'll bury his needle and he'll lift his presser foot and roll all that bulk fabric around so that he can sew across the upper end. There is no need to do any reversing here. Just do not break your stitch and sew across this. And then when you reach the next corner or the next line that he struck on the fabric, and he will use his reverse lever to position the needle right where he wants it. So he's pushing on the reverse lever, though you can't see it, and his needle is buried right where he wants it. He'll lift his presser foot and roll the assembly around yet one more time. Then simply sew down the other leg, right on top of the line that you struck. When you reach the tail, do some reversing there. And now your zipper plaque is installed. Now all we need to do is slit the fabric, so we'll take this assembly back to the table. With the underside of the Bimini facing up, Bill will now take a pair of scissors and cut through the vinyl and through this umbrella without cutting the zipper. So carefully cut along the yellow line. Cut all the way to the top where you sewed across at the stop point and stop short of that by about an 1/8 inch or so. Now the two zippers pull tabs are exposed, but we want to take the Sailrite edge hot knife and carefully touch the edges of this umbrella. And don't worry if you touch the vinyl as well, but this will help to seal the edges of this umbrella to keep them from unraveling. The end is within sight. Next, trimming tails. The tails are too long, so what we need to do is take a straight edge along the skirt and mark a line that's basically in line with the skirt edge. Then we'll take a can or a round container and place it at the corner of the tail so that we can make a smooth curved transition, which will make it easier when we come to sew the binding on the edge. We'll use the Sailrite edge hot knife to trim that excess off and also to round the edge. Or I should say corner. We'll follow this procedure for all 4 corners. We're going to now sew binding all around the perimeter of our Bimini, and we're going to start sewing at one of the backstay slits. But before you get started, you want to make sure you have enough thread on your bobbin, so that's what Bill is checking here. If you do not, we recommend starting with a brand new bobbin before you sew on your binding. Now all we have to do is shove our assembly into the binder. This is the 1-inch swing away binder from Sailrite. Binding is included with your Bimini skin kit. Do some reversing at the beginning. I typically like to sew a little bit off my assembly and reverse into the fabric and leave our binding a little bit long off the edge of the assembly. We'll trim it later on. Always pay attention to the exiting point of the binder, being sure that your fabric is pushed into the end of the binder, the end closest to the needle, not the end closest to Bill. When you reach one of the corners, this is the corner of the tail, because we made it a curved transition, we do not have to cut the binding. All we have to do is feed that curve into the binder and continue to sew around the perimeter. So the only thing you need to concentrate on is feeding the fabric assembly into the binder appropriately. Sometimes unzipping the zipper sleeves or pockets is a good idea when sewing on the binding. The only other thing you need to be concerned about is whether the binding is being fed in straight into the binder assembly. So sometimes binding will kink up before it gets fed into the binder. So just keep your eye on that. As long as you keep your eye on that, the only thing you have to be concerned about is feeding the assembly in the end of the binder, the end that is closest to the needle. So it goes into the fold of the binding all the way to the fold. Here we are coming to one more corner as we continue to sew around this entire assembly. Here we're coming to one of the backstay slits. Our Bimini top has 2 backstay slits. Yours may have 1 or none. And we did some reversing at that slit on both sides of the slit. We did not cut the binding there. We will actually just sew through that slit. So this one is actually zipped up or zipped together. So we can cut it there after we're done installing the entire length of binding. And now here's where we began, the opposite side of the backstay slit. And we'll do some reversing there, completing our binding assembly. We will sew back at about 1 inch, and we will sew a little bit off of the assembly, doing some reversing. And there we go. Our binding is installed. Now we can trim off the excess binding. We are going to trim off where we started and where we ended with the Sailrite edge hot knife, which seals the binding. And we're also going to cut through the second backstay slit where the binding is still joined together. So here we are cutting right through that. Okay, true, we don't have this Bimini mounted on a boat, so we're going to use a yardstick to simulate the backstay. And here you can see the zippers zip up to the backstay, no matter where it is in line with our backstay slit. That's the beauty of this system. And it also looks good on the bottom side and also on the top side. So those zippers just zip up to the wire and can be tucked in the assembly as shown here. Looks great on the underside and looks good on the top side. That's our backstay slit. The Bimini top's actually done, but we still have to install strap eyes to the bow to support it. In preparation for installing the strap eye, we need to remove the strapping tape, most of it, and also the double-sided tape on the bows. We will be leaving the strapping tape on at the 4 sides that goes down to our wooden platform with a snap hook on it. We find it easier to drill and install the strap eyes with the tubing secured. So Bill's got a length of rope here, and he will secure it right at the corner so that all 4 bows are wrapped tightly together and they do not move. We're going to show this in double time. We want to install a strap eye right above our strapping tape, about 1 inch or so. So he's determining a measurement from one of the jaw slides, and he will mark it on the board. You can't see that, but he marked that measurement on the board, so you can use it for a reference for all the other strap eyes. He's positioned his strap eye, the bottom portion of the strap eye, on that mark. Then he uses a spring-loaded center punch to create a dimple. This dimple will prevent our drill bit from wandering when we drill the hole. We're going to start with an 1/8 inch drill bit. We placed a little bit of cutting oil on the drill bit to prolong its life. The strap eye is installed to the primary or secondary bow so that it is in line with either the bow or the stern of the boat. And we will drill through the outer layer of tubing only with this 1/8 inch drill bit. Then we need to enlarge the hole with a larger drill bit. The stainless steel rivets that come with the Bimini frame kit require a size number 20 drill bit. That means we'll be making a hole size between 0.16 and 0.164 inch. We've made the first of 2 holes, so now we'll take our strap eye and insert our stainless steel rivet through that hole without setting it yet. We'll position our strap eye so that it is directly on top of that bow, and we'll use our spring-loaded punch to create a dimple again. Now we'll use the 1/8 inch drill bit and drill a hole, then we'll use our size number 20 drill bit and enlarge the hole. Since we're building a Bimini skin kit, we want you to know that the rivets and the strap eyes come in the Bimini frame kits. If you didn't order a Bimini frame kit, you can order these parts by looking at the material list at the end of this video. And now we'll position our strap eye and insert a second stainless steel rivet that's included with the Bimini frame kits. Now be careful, wear eye protection because sometimes the mandrels will fly out. These stainless steel rivets are very hard to set because they're made of stainless steel, so it will take quite a bit of pressure to finally set the rivet. Then follow that same procedure for the second rivet. Be sure to wear eye protection. On the secondary bow, one strap eye will be installed on the port side and starboard side, and on the primary bow, one will be installed on the port and starboard side. Bill's flipping the frame over so he can install it on the primary bow now, directly above the one on the bottom side. He's going to use a measurement here and repeat that procedure. We will not show all of that. Now we can cut away the strapping tape that secured the 4 sides of our Bimini and remove the snap hook, because we'll need that snap hook when we make webbing straps. Install your Bimini is next. We're going to be installing it on the wooden platform. You would probably be installing it on your boat. Bill will now install the finished Bimini top, this is the 4-bow Bimini top, to the 4-bow frame. We will not show how to make adjustable webbing straps in this video, but you will need to do that, and each one of the Bimini skin kits includes all of the hardware that you will need to make those adjustable support straps. So here are the adjustable webbing support straps that we made. If you'd like to see a video of how that's done, click the link at the top right. The initial setup of the Bimini top will require a little bit of adjustment. Each of the webbing support straps are meant to tension the Bimini top, but the Bimini top also needs to be positioned on the frame so it's equal on both the port side and starboard side. In other words, the skirt line is equally spaced from side to side. After the Bimini top fabric is spaced evenly from port to starboard, then you can start to tension up the support straps in an effort to level the Bimini top and to remove as many wrinkles as possible. The tighter you make the Bimini straps, the smoother and nicer your Bimini top will look. Oftentimes, people will put rigid support struts in Bimini frames so they can get the maximum tension possible. Our webbing straps are attached to strap eyes that are screwed to a wooden platform, and unfortunately, under a great deal of tension, the wooden platform warps. That won't be the case if your strap eye is mounted to the deck or a solid surface. You'll be able to tension it more than we can here in this video. After sewing the Bimini top, you can expect a little bit of shrinkage. That's normal in any sewing application. When we started, we were reaching for a 98-inch spread, and as you can see here, it ended up being about 96.5 inches, so a little bit of shrinkage is expected. Coming up next is the materials list and the tools that we used to build this 4-bow Bimini. Most of the materials required to build a Bimini top are included in the Sailrite Bimini skin kits. There are some materials that come in the Bimini frame kits that are sold separately. If you would like to make modifications to either the Bimini skin kits or the Bimini frame kits, be sure to give us a call. We're glad to make modifications to your requirements. This should be a complete list of the tools that we used in this video to build this 4-bow Bimini top. The supplies to make the Backstay Slit are not included in the kits, so here's a detailed list of the supplies you'll need per Backstay Slit. Our 4-bow Bimini top is now complete. We mounted our frame to a wooden platform to make it easier for patterning and building the Bimini top. Our next step would be to remove all of the hardware on the platform and mount it on the boat. If you have any questions about the Sailrite Bimini kits, whether it be a frame kit or a skin kit, or if you want to make modifications, be sure to give us a call. Here are some related videos to building a Bimini top. They may be helpful with your next DIY project. It's your loyal patronage to Sailrite that makes these free videos available. I'm Eric Grant, and from all of us here at Sailrite, thanks for watching.